Hello guys, and welcome to a bit of an unusual kit build for me today. I've had this kit for a while. In fact, it was the first kit that I bought when I moved back to the UK in July 2021. So I've had it over 3 years, and I have sort of been putting this off because I've always thought of it as being a super complicated, highly detailed, high part count kit. But actually, when I cracked the box open recently and had a look, it certainly is highly detailed, but it doesn't have that high a part count, and the instructions are relatively skinny. This of course falls squarely into the what if category, and I think this is Das Werk's first aircraft subject if I remember correctly. So the Junkers EF-126 was a proposed design for a simple pulse jet aircraft, and it was drawn up by the Germans in 1944-1945. Of course, given the tide of the war at that time, no prototypes were built by the Germans. However, the Soviet Union did create 2 unpowered and 3 powered prototypes in the 3 years after the war. We do have a couple of photographs here, but they're grainy enough and blurry enough to make me slightly suspicious of their origin. There was a later iteration of the aircraft called the EF-127 which aimed to replace the pulse jet with a rocket. However, there were no prototypes of this built. As you can see on the box, Das Werk called it a 3-in-1 kit, and that's because you can build either the single engine pulse jet version, the twin engine pulse jet version, which I think might be completely fictitious, or the version with the integrated rockets. Let's take a look at the instructions because I do think they are pretty high quality and worth pointing out. And we do get quite a lot in this kit. So initially here on this page we have what I thought was the basis of the cockpit floor or something when I started to build the model. Then I realised this is just a stand if we want to build this aircraft in a sort of factory scene under construction. So that's a nice option to have included. We get some very nice colour diagrams of the cockpit layout. And then down here when we're building the cockpit, we have the option to build the aircraft here without the wings, again to go on that factory stand, or we have a different part with a spar in it which will hold those wings on. And then later on in the instructions we have the option of building the landing skid in the raised retracted position, so in flight, or in the lowered position, either ready for a landing or having landed. And here you can see the diagrams of the 3 options we've got: the EF-126 single engine, the EF-126 dual engine, which doesn't look much different but the 2 engines are in a V configuration so the one behind can't be seen, and then the EF-127 which is the rocket propelled version. So overall, quite a lot of options in this kit. The cockpit itself doesn't consist of that many parts, but as you can see, it is pretty well detailed. We've got a rail there for what looks like an ejection seat, or certainly a mounting rail for the seat. These side panels are slightly odd. They have a recess there for presumably like a machine gun or something, although we don't get any machine guns in the kit. We have some instruments to busy up the cockpit. And I do like this top and bottom design rather than having the 2 halves of the aircraft. I know you still have a seam line to deal with, but I do seem to prefer that. One thing I did notice though was that a lot of the sprue gates do tend to be on the connecting edges, and so it can be difficult to get a nice smooth join between 2 halves like this. I didn't have any RLM66 for the cockpit, and I didn't even have any grey at hand, so instead I went for something that resembles RLM02, which was actually Tamiya XF22. I know it's not historically accurate, but neither is this whole aircraft. As always, I use Vallejo model colour to pick out any details in the cockpit, and for anything metallic I used Vallejo metal colour. The wings on the EF-126 were made from plywood, and here that's simply an upper piece, a lower piece, a weapons rack, and some control surfaces. As you can see here, that T-shaped spar helps to make sure the wings are in exactly the right place. At this point, when we build the rear of the fuselage, we have to make our decision about which version we're going for, and I'm going for this dual engine version of the 126. Again, a simple design on the two engines, although again the seam line was a bit difficult to deal with in places due to those sprue gates. You can see here the relatively simple mounting system of the engines, with this V-shaped piece going to the fuselage, and then a simple design like so. One connects below and one connects above the fin, presumably because the engines are exactly the same piece rather than being handed. Here's a good example of those sprue gates, 3 of them, all on the mating surface. I must say I do like the system that Das Werk have used for mounting the horizontal stabilisers and the wings. The 2 pins there make sure they go in perfectly well, and there's no play in them, so you don't have to worry about getting them level and matching each other on each side. Equally, keying the fuselage here means it goes in perfectly as intended into the front of the fuselage. One other option that we get in the kit, which I forgot to mention, is if we don't want to use the factory scene, we can use this trolley for display of the vehicle, either taking it out to the takeoff strip or returning it after a landing. Again, it's just a nice inclusion from Das Werk. I'm going to use this trolley, and I'm going to have the aircraft on it with the landing skid extended as if it's returning from a mission. The landing skid is quite delicate, and I found it easier to connect the arms to the fuselage rather than to the landing skid and then trying to get them in the right angle. We do have the option of weapons in this series of rockets. I decided not to include them, but they are there in the kit. At this stage everything was given a coat of Tamiya grey primer, and I did have to get to work with some filler in some of those seam lines and do a bit of sanding, a bit of repriming, before I could put down some XF69 pre-shading. The instructions suggest a good number of paint schemes for this, all of them of course fictional. I did at one point consider looking at the reference photo and copying that filler and putty that's used there on the panel lines. I think that's used to improve the aerodynamic efficiency of the aircraft, think you see something similar on the ME-262, but then I decided against that in the end. We've got a variety of schemes here, a natural metal finish and a couple of prototype schemes, and then further down the page a couple of sort of combat schemes from sort of late 1945 or early 1946 in kind of standard German camouflage colours. We also have the green version there with the red star for the Soviet test unit, which actually is probably the only potentially accurate colour scheme here in the instructions. As well as those side views, we also get the top views. And I really like this version here with the natural metal fuselage and the bare plywood wings. This second version here is sort of a yellow colour. I think that looks a little bit too much like a tank to me. And then we have the combat versions here with the RLM 75 and 74, or the 80 and 81 over the page. So to prepare for that, I gave the aircraft some NATO black panel line pre-shading, and I gave the wings a coat of XF55, which is tan. That will form the base of the wood. The two engines were painted in Vallejo model colour steel, which is this lovely dark colour. You do have to be a bit careful with these paints not to get runs. I did have to sand some off and go back over them again. And the aircraft itself was painted in model colour aluminium, and you can see here I have gone a little bit too heavy there, and I've got a couple of runs on the fuselage there that need to be sanded away and repainted. But I think this was not a terrible effort for my first natural metal paint job. It does highlight the fact that the smoothness of your base coat is really important. Even though I'm not looking for a shiny chrome finish, these metal finishes really show up every imperfection. Hopefully you can see here on the engine, although I haven't done a great job of it, I've tried to lighten it slightly at the end with a light burnt metal colour. I didn't really thin the paint enough, I think, and it hasn't quite got a smooth transition there yet. Equally, I've done some of the metal control surfaces really well, and a couple of them with runs on them. So again, that needs sanding and repainting. Das Werk do make a separate wooden decal sheet for this, but I wasn't able to find it, so I just brought these generic light plywood decals, or decal sheet should I say. You cut it to size. And looking at the instructions, we've got a number of plywood sheets that make up the wing, so I cut the pieces to shape. I did a test on the horizontal stabilizer, and the grain is visible, but as you can see it is very, very faint. And at this stage I realised that if I wanted a good effect, I would need to vary the colour of the underlying paint in order to get a sort of a variety of plywood colours. Unfortunately, because the decal sheet is quite small, I had to really cram these in. I would have liked to have varied the angle of the grain on a few of those, but I simply didn't have enough space on the sheet. What I did do is cut out an overall decal for the entire wing, and then cut it into triangular shapes, and then at least I could exchange those between wings so that the grain wasn't one continuous piece for the entire wing. As you can see here, I've masked off various panels and painted them in a slightly different shade of brown. Primarily this was using XF60, which is desert yellow, and that worked to varying degrees. I think there's a bit too much contrast really between the buff and the desert yellow. I should have darkened the buff, I think. And the very dark panels I've got here are just a bit too dark and you can't quite see the wood grain decal there. Probably the best combination I found was either buff with some clear orange or some desert yellow. Das Werk supplies with a healthy decal sheet with lots of options. Most of these will be irrelevant for this wood and aluminium prototype version, but also because it is a what-if aircraft, we're quite free to do what we want. The instructions also note that German industry often put various stamps onto aluminium panels, and they supply a variety of those to us to use as we wish. I started with some standard stencils, including the no entry or no step stencils on the control surfaces. Unfortunately here you can also see some of the silvering that's happened on those wood decals. According to Google Translate, this stencil here tells us to make sure the bolts are tight for the rocket boosters before every flight, which is perhaps a little bit worrying. We have tyre PSI information for the trolley, and some kind of identification number on the tail fins. Here are the aluminium manufacturing stamps that I mentioned. I wasn't quite sure how these would be applied and whether or not they'd only be at the edge of panels or if they just were across big sheets of aluminium which would be cut up, but I put them where I felt was sensible at the edge of panels. At this point I gave the entire aircraft a coat of VMS flat varnish. That might seem odd over an aluminium finish, but I didn't really want a super shiny metal finish, and I think this actually works quite well with the aluminium. Unfortunately you can now see quite a lot of silvering underneath those wooden wing decals. With the rocket boosters and the jet engines added, it was time to do a sepia oil paint wash. This was applied around all the panel lines, of course, and I think it provides a nice contrast to that aluminium. And as always, it was cleaned up with a brush lightly dampened with odourless thinner. I don't really mind if there's some spread of colour between the panel lines, because it does help make a sort of slightly dirtier appearance to the aircraft. With that done, it was a case of putting the landing skid in position, and then attaching that securely to the trolley, adding the canopy, and my EF-126 was complete. So there we go guys, that was my build of the Das Werk 1/32 scale EF-126 Ellie. I really enjoyed building this kit and I feel a bit silly putting it off for so long because it was a nice easy build, a good amount of detail but also really nice construction. Some of the seam lines were a bit of a pain, but in general really fun. I am fairly happy with the overall result, but I do think my modelling skills have let me down in a couple of key areas here. Some of the seam lines, I think particularly with the metal finish, and not as well removed and sanded as they could be. And that silvering under the wooden decals on the wings is a pain, and it's, I messed up there. I rushed it. I should have properly gloss coated it and made sure the surface was smoother. Nevertheless, I think the final result is okay, and it was a good learning experience for me. With an aircraft like this, even with a metal finish, I think there's going to be some tarnishing and damage to that metal finish. So it doesn't really matter that there's some imperfections here. In that sense, it was a good preparation for future finishes that I might want to do, where I might want a much smoother, shinier, more chrome-like finish. So yes, overall very happy with the kit and pretty happy with the result. I would like to thank all of you for watching. Well done if you got this far into the video. And of course, special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. They have seen a number of projects that I have in the pipeline at the moment and their current work in progress status, so they'll have a good idea of what's coming up in my future videos. If you don't want to miss one of those, then please do remember to hit the subscribe button. Once again, thank you for watching, and until next time, have fun modelling.